Plessy versus Ferguson was a very important case in American history. It encouraged a new view of racism.
Homer A. Plessy was a carpenter in Louisiana who was 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African American. Because he resembled the image of a white individual, he was chosen to participate in this experiment by a civil rights group called the Citizens Committee. Plessy wanted to test the constitutionality of the Louisiana law that required black and white segregation on trains. So, on June 7, 1892, Plessy decided to sit on the white designated car on the train even though he was classified as black under Louisiana law. This led to Plessy's arrest and trial under John H. Ferguson. Ferguson, the Louisiana state judge, ruled against Plessy in trial and came to the conclusion that his arrest did not violate Plessy's rights.
More than 3 years later, the case reached the United States Supreme Court. Plessy argued that this decision violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Tourget, Plessy's attorney, was a civil rights activist. He argued that Plessy had been robbed of his property because he was mostly white and is being disconnected from the white association. Whites controlled the avenues of advancement and therefore had the property to unlock the door of opportunity. Tourget also argued the separate car law with the 13th and the 14th Amendment. He challenged the court to sit in a Jim Crow car and think about the humiliation they would experience.
On May 18, 1896, the court voted on the Plessy v. Ferguson. By a vote of 7-1, they decided against Plessy. The new doctrine of separate but equal was established. This ruling justified the idea of segregation. Separate but equal was the idea that blacks and whites will remain segregated, but they will still remain equal. They will be given different schools, entrances, exits, bathrooms, waiting rooms, and any other public place, but their separate places should remain on the same level.
However, there was not always equality within the segregated places. Whites tended to remain superior within society. Black places did not withhold the same conditions.
Black areas were considered dirty and not on the same scale as white places. Black schools were not as nice as white schools, and black restrooms were not as nice as white restrooms.
Jim Crow laws became extremely enforced and created a large divide between the two races. This case was considered historically significant because it caused the first legalized act of segregation that impacted the next 60 years. The decision of the Supreme Court led to a large setback of civil rights for African Americans and many racial movements to arise.
First of all, it took them 4 years before the court heard the case.
Whew, that's a long time.
Tourget again argued that the state of Louisiana had violated the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery.
How did requiring Plessy to ride in the colored car make him a slave?
Tourget's point was that separate cars implied that blacks were inferior to whites, a belief that was central to the institution of slavery.
That seems like a bit of a stretch to me.
The court agreed with you, saying that distinguishing between citizens based on their color didn't destroy their legal equality or reestablish a state of involuntary servitude.
Did Plessy have any other arguments?
Well, his attorney also argued that the state of Louisiana had violated the 14th Amendment.
Why?
The Progressive Era was a time when people wanted to improve the flaws of society and industrial effects. This case led to the progressive movement in trying to fix the social issues coinciding with the Jim Crow laws and the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. To improve the stance of African Americans, several reformers worked to gain civil rights. The Plessy versus Ferguson case led to a setback in social progressivism for African Americans at first. The case validated, generalized, and legalized segregation, making the race go backwards in their fight for more rights. To fix this issue, and with progressivism in mind, Booker T. Washington and Du Bois worked to achieve the 15th Amendment, which gave all men, no matter the race, the right to vote. Slowly but surely, African Americans began to see improvements after years of strict segregation.
Overall, the Plessy versus Ferguson case was one of the most significant cases to be heard by the Supreme Court. It established segregation which justified racism. For the next 6 years in history, African Americans fought to gain their civil rights until the Brown versus Board of Education case ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. Plessy versus Ferguson allowed for African American social reform and aided the progressive era.